Genesis 30, an exegetical and biblical theological commentary, introduction to the narrative context. Within the progressive unfolding of the divine promise plan, Genesis chapter 30 represents a critical structural transition from a singular covenant lineage to the inclusive expansion of the corporate people of God. The foundational promises given to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 3, and chapter 15, verse 5, and reaffirmed to Isaac in Genesis chapter 26, verses 1 through 5, required an exponential multiplying of the seed. In this chapter, multiplication is achieved not in an idealized, conflict-free environment, but within the fractured competitive matrix of a polygynous patriarchal household enduring Mesopotamian exile. The broader biblical worldview frames this narrative as a subtle subversion of local ancient Near Eastern legal conventions, fertility practices, and territorial deities. Here, the divine strategy of election shifts dramatically. Whereas prior generations narrowed the covenant line by choosing one son and excluding another, for example, Isaac over Ishmael and Jacob over Esau, the election of Jacob's family becomes corporate and inclusive. Every son born in this narrative, regardless of his mother's socio-legal status or the moral ambiguity surrounding his conception, is organically subsumed into the single unified identity of Israel. Exegesis of Genesis. Chapter 30. Domestic strife and surrogacy arrangements, verses 1 through 13. The pericope opens with Rachel's intense desperation due to her ongoing infertility. Her exclamation in verse 1, "Give me children or I shall die," reflects the immense socio-cultural pressure placed upon women in the ancient Mediterranean world, where a woman's value was heavily indexed to her reproductive capacity. Jacob's sharp theological response in verse 2 establishes that the opening and closing of the womb fall exclusively under divine sovereignty. Rachel's distress highlights the ancient reality that childbirth was inherently perilous and frequently fatal, a reality that tragically foreshadows her own death during the birth of Benjamin in Genesis chapter 35, verses 16 through 18. To bypass her biological limitations, Rachel utilizes a surrogate motherhood arrangement by giving her slave girl, Bilhah, to Jacob in verse 3. Her demand that Bilhah bear upon my knees invokes a widely attested Near Eastern and Hittite legal gesture, signifying the formal legitimation and adoption of the offspring. This practice aligns precisely with ancient legal frameworks such as the laws of Hammurabi, which regulated the use of handmaids by childless wives to secure inheritance rights and preserve the family line. Bilhah conceives and bears two sons. Rachel names the first Dan, meaning vindicated, declaring that God has judged her case and heard her voice in verse 6. She names the second Naphtali, meaning struggled, framing the birth within her intense competitive wrestlings against her sister Leah in verse 8. Recognizing that her own period of initial fertility has paused, Leah retaliates by deploying her handmaid, Zilpah, as a surrogate in verse 9. Zilpah gives birth to Gad in verse 11 and Asher in verse 13. In the Hebraic cognitive environment, these names carry complex cultural baggage. Gad translates directly to good luck or fortune, while Asher means happy. Both names possess etymological ties to West Semitic and Aramaic Canaanite fortune and fertility deities, demonstrating that the patriarchal family still operated with pagan Mesopotamian cultural trappings, even as it was being used to construct the tribes of Israel. The mandrake barter and Leah's renewed fertility, verses 14 through 21. During the wheat harvest, Leah's eldest son Reuben discovers mandrakes, known in Hebrew as dudaim, in the field in verse 14. In the ancient Near East, mandrakes were prized as natural aphrodisiacs, believed to possess magical properties that could stimulate sexual desire and cure barrenness. Rachel's eager demand for the roots reveals her continued reliance on human manipulation and sympathetic magical practices to induce fertility. Rachel barters her night with Jacob in exchange for the mandrakes, exposing the deep-seated rivalry and the strict intra-family status ladder governing the household. When Jacob returns from the fields, Leah flatly informs him in verse 16, "You must share my bed tonight. I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." The text showcases a brilliant narrative irony that undercuts ancient fertility superstitions. Rachel, who possesses the mandrakes, remains barren. Leah, who surrendered the mandrakes, immediately conceives because God listened to Leah in verse 17. Leah gives birth to Issachar, meaning hired or reward, and Zebulun, meaning exalted or honor, followed by a daughter, Dinah. This sequence underscores the primary theological principle that human mechanics cannot command the promise plan. Biological life is a sovereign gift from the Creator, divine remembrance in the birth of Joseph, verses 22 through 24. The theological turning point of the narrative occurs in verse 22. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. In biblical theology, divine remembrance does not imply previous cognitive amnesia. Rather, it signals a definitive, planned intervention by Yahweh to enact His covenant promises at the strategically appointed historical moment. Rachel gives birth to a son and names him Joseph, generating a double wordplay. She states in verses 23 and 24, God has taken away my reproach, using a word related to Asaph, and adds, May the Lord add to me another son, playing on Yosef. Within the structural arc of the Genesis narrative, Joseph's birth serves as the catalyst for the next major movement of redemption. It provides Jacob with the familial resolution necessary to formally request his release from Laban and begin planning his return to the promised land of Canaan. Outwitting Laban through divine direction, verses 25 through 43. Having completed his 14 years of mandated service for his wives, Jacob negotiates a new livestock arrangement with Laban. Jacob proposes to take only the speckled, spotted, and dark-colored sheep and goats as his wage animals, those that represented a distinct genetic minority in ancient Near Eastern flocks, in verses 32 and 33. Laban eagerly agrees, but immediately resorts to deception by removing all the existing striped and spotted animals a 3-day journey away to prevent crossbreeding in verses 35 and 36. Jacob responds by placing peeled rods of poplar, almond, and plane trees in the watering troughs where the robust flocks breed, intending to induce the birth of streaked, speckled, and spotted offspring in verses 37 through 39. Modern readers often view this technique as a manifestation of ancient folk medicine or sympathetic magic, the fashioning of physical objects to produce a desired natural effect. While Jacob operates within the cultural methods of his era, the text strictly attributes his staggering economic success to direct divine intervention. As Jacob later clarifies in his dream report in Genesis chapter 31, the strategy of the striped rams was communicated to him through an angelic vision from the God of Bethel to thwart Laban's systematic exploitation. Yahweh accommodated himself to cultural frameworks familiar to Jacob to vindicate his servant. Jacob's subsequent accumulation of vast wealth, male and female servants, and large herds in verse 43 proves that the execution of the promise plan is secured by the sovereign power of God over and against human avarice and structural trickery. New Testament appropriations of Genesis, chapter 30. Later biblical writers organically connect the historical realities, familial dysfunctions, and elective dynamics of Genesis chapter 30 to show how God progressively fulfills His single promise plan through sovereign grace rather than human merit. In his letter to the Romans, chapters 9, verses 6 through 13, the Apostle Paul unpacks the underlying theological framework of patriarchal election to demonstrate that physical lineage from Abraham does not automatically guarantee status within the true eschatological Israel. Paul insists that God's covenant purposes operate strictly on the basis of His sovereign choice, not because of works, but because of Him who calls. While Genesis chapter 30 demonstrates the inclusive consolidation of the 12 tribes from a highly imperfect family, Paul uses the twinship of Jacob and Esau to defend a robust, non-supersessionist theology. National election secures historical covenant privileges for ethnic Israel, while individual election ensures the preservation of a faithful remnant in every generation. In Galatians chapter 3, verse 16, Paul explicitly traces the progressive development of the promised seed, the Greek term sperma, illustrating that the ultimate fulfillment of the Abrahamic covenant narrows down to Christ. The convoluted, legally messy, and highly competitive maternal origins of the 12 patriarchs in Genesis chapter 30 underscore that the fulfillment of redemptive history does not rely on human purity or biological perfection, but on the miraculous direct intervention of God. The Gospel of Matthew chapter 1 verses 1 through 5 shows that the Matthean genealogy purposely includes Judah, the fourth son born to the unloved Leah during this tumultuous narrative cycle, as the royal line of the Messiah. Furthermore, Matthew mimics the unexpected inclusive pattern of Genesis chapter 30, which incorporated handmaids and foreign cultural dynamics, by intentionally weaving legally compromised or foreign women, Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, and Bathsheba, into the formal lineage of Yeshua, highlighting that God consistently uses the marginalized and the unexpected to bring about his cosmic fulfillments. Theological synthesis. The historical and narrative complexities of Genesis chapter 30 offer a powerful demonstration of the organic unity of Scripture as articulated through Walter C. Kaiser Jr.'s Promise Plan theology. The chapter exposes the deep fractures of human nature, jealousy, exploitation, polygamous competition, and reliance on sympathetic magic, yet reveals that human sin is utterly incapable of thwarting the divine decree. This text serves as a vital corrective to both classical dispensationalism and covenant theology by refusing to impose artificial administrative binaries or over-spiritualize concrete historical realities. The concrete, localized events in Padan Aram, the physical opening of wombs, and the material multiplying of spotted flocks retain their original historical significance for ethnic Israel, validating God's enduring faithfulness to the physical descendants of Abraham. Concurrently, these events point forward to a grander cosmic reality. Just as the 12 distinct sons of free women and bondmaids were subsumed into one covenant nation, and just as Joseph's later half-Egyptian sons were formally adopted into the tribes, the Promise Plan ultimately moves toward the inclusive engrafting of all nations into the single family of God through the redemptive work of Yeshua the Messiah.